Welcome to Nazarene, Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this part 10 of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about the end time harvests that are mentioned in Revelation chapter 14. So there's a lot of activity and a lot of action that takes place in the book of Revelation, and it's very easy to get it confused. So we want to help people stay oriented. A simple mnemonic device or a parable that Yahweh gave me many years ago is what I call the parable of the pregnant bride. And most of us are familiar with how a bride bears a growing burden over 9 months or 40 weeks. So the parable seems to fit. So the seals represent, again, a bride's growing burden over 9 months or 40 weeks. Then she has the labor pains. These are analogous to the trumpets. At a certain point, the labor pains get so bad, the bride cries out in pain, and these are analogous to the thunders which take place in the latter half or the latter part of the trumpets. Then at a certain point, the bride's waters break, and this is analogous to the cups. And then, of course, a man-child is born, and we'll see later on in this series that the man-child is born at Armageddon. So then, if you want to see the full Revelation timeline, the detailed timeline, that's available both in the book, Revelation and the End Times. It's available on Amazon.com, or you can also access it from the website. You can download a PDF copy for free. But here's the simplified version of the Revelation timeline. So second line down, we see the 7 seals, which is where the armies of the world are marshaled into their places. And then at seal 6, the sky recedes like a scroll. Now this is what we could call a limited nuclear war. Probably won't seem very limited at the time. Probably will be called World War III. But after seal 6, after the sky recedes like a scroll, and before we get to seal 7, there's mentioned in Revelation chapter 7, the sealing of the 144,000, 12,000 from each of the tribes. Then we get, now the location in between seal 6 and seal 7 tells us that this event is going to take place somewhere around this time. It's going to take place probably after the sky recedes like a scroll, and then before we get to the trumpets, during this half-hour silence in heaven. So the seal 7 opens the trumpets, but again, there's a half an hour of silence, which is 20 years and 10 months. And then we will see 7 years of trumpets, or 7 years of trials and woes. And the second half, or the last 3.5 years, is the time of Jacob's trouble. And in the midway mark, that's where we expect to see the abomination that makes desolate go up. Now, when we get to the end of the trumpets, when we get to trumpet 7 is when Babylon the Great is judged, and the kingdom is then given to the saints. The cup judgments will be poured out on Babylon, but before we get to the 7 cup judgments, we see 3 inset chapters, chapters 12, 13, and 14. So chapter 12 deals with Israel in the wilderness. Chapter 13 deals with 2 beasts, or actually 2 facets of the same end-time Babylonian beast. One facet is a governmental facet, and the second facet being a government state-sponsored religion facet. But then we get to chapter 14, and is speaking of the end-time harvests. Now, what we're going to see is that there's at least 3 harvests in Revelation chapter 14. One of these harvests is simply called the firstfruits, and we're going to see that this is the 144,000 who were sealed between seal 6 and 7 when they are redeemed from the earth. And this may mean that they die either at trumpet 7 or during the cup judgments, or however that goes. We're also going to see 2 different grain harvests. It's going to show up as one grain harvest, but we'll see that there's 2 different first fruit harvests of grain that we're concerned with, one of barley and one of wheat. And then we're also going to see a grape harvest. And if we are willing to accept it, it may be, if the analogy fits, it may be that the harvesting of the grapes is what symbolically fills the cups of wrath, which are then poured out upon Babylon. But the symbology of the grain and the vine goes all the way back to the earliest parts of the Torah. So if we go to Genesis 14 and verse 18, we read, "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Bread, of course, being made from grain, and wine, of course, being made from grapes. And he was priest of Elohim Most High. So in the Torah, again, there's two different first fruit harvests, and these take place in the spring during the time of the spring festivals. One of which, the first one that we see, is what's called the omer, or the wave sheaf. And this is where Israel brings the first ripening barley to the priesthood. And then when the first crescent sliver of the new moon is sighted, and they have ripe or ready or aviv barley in hand, this is how we know that the Torah calendar year begins. So in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 10, it says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf or an omer of the first fruits of your harvest, your barley harvest, to the priest." And again, this takes place around the Passover time. And this begins the 50-day count up to the Pentecost. So then at the Pentecost, that comes about the time of the wheat harvest. So in verse 17, it says, "You shall bring from your dwellings 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah," which would be of wheat. "They shall be of fine flour, and they shall be baked with leaven. They are the first fruits to Yahweh." So again, we see that speaking of the grain harvest, we're going to see one grain harvest in Revelation 14, but this may be symbolic of more than one reaping because there's more than one first fruits offering given in the Torah. So we see this symbology extend if we go to Matthew chapter 26 and verse 26, speaking of the Last Supper. So it says, "As they were eating, Yeshua took bread," which is grain, "blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.'" Verse 27, "Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the renewed covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins.'" So what we see is that there's this symbolism of Yeshua's body in the grains, and then also Yeshua's atoning sacrifice in his blood, which is the vine or the cups. So in Revelation 14 and verse 1, we're going to meet the 144,000 again. It says, "Then I looked, and behold, a lamb standing on Mount Sion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name written on their foreheads." Now, there's a perennial debate as to whether this is Mount Sion in the heavenly realms or whether this is Mount Sion on earth. And depending on the rest of your theology, it can swing either way. But I'd like to make the argument that this is Mount Sion in the heavenly realms. And we're going to see some evidence for this in the verses coming up. So verse 2, it says, "And I heard a voice from heaven, like the voice of many waters, and like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. And they sang as it were a new song before the throne." Now notice it's before the throne. Well, where is the throne room? The throne room is in heaven. It says, "Before the 4 living creatures, which are in heaven, and the elders, who we saw earlier, are already in heaven. And no one could learn that song, except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth." So when it says that the 144,000 were redeemed from the earth, it's a pretty strong indication that they're no longer on the earth. So I believe that when the 144,000 are standing with Yeshua on Mount Sion, we understand that this is a reference to being in heaven. So what this means then, if they've been redeemed from the earth, it means that they die, somewhere in between Trumpet 7 and the cup judgments, or some perhaps during the cup judgments. And this is not a bad thing. We have to remember to look at things from Yahweh's perspective and understand that it's not this life, it's not this world that we're so concerned with. We need to lay down our lives in this world for the promise of his eternal reward in the hereafter. So continuing to verse 4, it says, "These are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they're virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to Elohim and to the Lamb." So again, it says that the 144,000 were redeemed from among men. So we believe that they must be dead at this point. But again, this is a good thing because they are the first fruits. And later in this series, we're going to see that they have a blessing pronounced over them before they are killed. So continuing to verse 5. It says, and in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before the throne of Elohim. And once again, I would like to argue that this is, the reason it says before the throne is because this is a picture of the heavenly realms. So verse 6 says, then I saw another messenger flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting good news to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, fear Elohim and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. And we know the hour of judgment is Trumpet 7 because that's when Babylon the Great is judged and her kingdom is then given to the saints. It says, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and springs of water. And another messenger followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, is fallen. And again, we know this is a reference to Trumpet 7. Anytime you see Babylon is fallen, that's a reference to Trumpet 7. So that's a way we can help stay oriented. It says, that great city, or simply that great, Babylon the Great, depending on the version you're reading. We'll talk about that in the next slide. Because she's made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So depending on the version you're reading, the Textus Receptus was a Greek text. Now, in general, we believe in what's called a Semitic inspiration of Scripture, meaning we believe that the Scripture, the renewed covenant, was written either in Hebrew and or Aramaic, but then it was soon translated thereafter into Greek. And in fact, the ante-Nicene fathers, or the early church fathers, tell us this exact thing. But there's a difference in versions, and some people believe that the Textus Receptus, or the so-called, the alleged received text, we see that it reads one way, and then there's what they have come to believe is a more accurate text, what they call the Nestle-Aland text, and it reads slightly different, slightly another way. So I just bring this up because there's a difference in the versions, and it makes a big difference in understanding and interpretation. So we take a look now this is the Greek of Revelation 14 and verse 8. So what we see is you'll see two sets of purple numbers, and the top set is Textus Receptus, and the bottom set is Nestle-Aland. And I believe they were on Nestle-Aland 27 at the time this slide was taken. Now they're on 29, I guess. But it says, and another angel, another there followed, saying, is fallen, Babylon, that great city. So the Textus Receptus has the word city, but the Nestle-Aland doesn't have the word city. The Nestle-Aland simply says, and another angel, another there followed, saying, is fallen, Babylon the Great. So it makes a big difference whether we're talking about a city being Babylon, because we'll see later that Rome is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. But we'll also see that the United States of America is the land of Babylon. So there's arguments to be made that it could be New York City we're talking about, or it could also be Washington, D.C., and there's also physical manifestations that agree with that. We can also make the case for the city of London, or perhaps some other cities as well. But if we say Babylon the Great is fallen, that to me makes the most sense. And if we're talking, because we're talking about the judgment of the great harlot Babylon, and she falls. So when Babylon falls, we're talking about the entire Judeo-Christian, Islamic, and also Esau democratic world. Because as we've seen in earlier slide sets, this is the beast system. It's when Judah and Joseph and Ishmael have all been sort of glued or tied together through the function and purpose of Esau Roman democracy, setting up this Babylonian world government system based on the Greco-Roman concept of shared power and democracy instead of theocracy, which is what Yahweh's people are called to. But we're also going to see other references to Trumpet 7. We're going to see Babylon fall in Revelation 16 and also in Revelation 18. So when we see this in future slide sets, we just need to understand that what this is doing is this is the book of Revelation giving us a time point to help keep things in order. So if we remember anytime we see Babylon is fallen, that's a reference to Trumpet 7, it can really help us stay oriented. So continuing on to verse 9, it says, "Then a third messenger followed them, saying with a loud voice, 'If anyone worships the beast in his image and receives his mark,'" as we saw in the last slide set, is allegiance to the beast system, "and receives his mark on his forehead or on his hand." So let's continue on. "He himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of Elohim, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation." So we're talking about when the harlot is judged at Trumpet 7, and when the cups of wrath are poured out upon the harlot during the cups. It says, "And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the set-apart messengers and in the presence of the Lamb." So again, we're talking about this great and traumatic time, which will basically, now if Seal 6 is going to look like a limited thermonuclear war, probably the cup judgments are going to look like what we might call an all-out thermonuclear war. And unless we're in Yahweh's favor and obeying him and what he says to do, the likelihood of survival is not great. As we're going to see later, the way we survive is to obey Yahweh and to keep his son's faith and to do the things that he says to do. So verse 11, it says, "And the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast in his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name." So just to recap from the last slide set, the mark of the beast on the right hand or on the forehead, this is allegiance to the beast system, basically living our lives in the world. But to take the mark of Yahweh, that means that everything we do and everything we think basically needs to be focused upon Yahweh and Yeshua. So our allegiance to Yahweh is the mark of Yahweh. Our lack of allegiance to Yahweh is the mark of the beast. And then we don't worry quite so much about the physical manifestations, whether we're talking about iris scanning or biometrics or even, I don't recommend taking a chip, but if they want to give us a chip, then as we spoke of in the last slide set, that's not the mark. Because there's, as Yeshua said, there's nothing that comes from outside a man that can defile him. It's what takes place in the heart. That's what defiles him. So verse 12, continuing on, it says, "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of Elohim and the faith of Yeshua." And brothers, in order to be counted as keeping the faith of Yeshua, we have to actually keep the faith of Yeshua. This is how we get the mark of Elohim, is to be obeying his son's faith. Continuing to verse 13. It says, "Then I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, 'Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Master from now on,'" meaning after Trumpet 7. "Yes," says the Spirit, "that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them." So what this is saying is, if we are faithful and true to Yahweh, and if we are keeping Yeshua's faith, and if we're walking the faith as we know how to walk it, so we receive the mark of Yahweh, the seal of Yahweh, in between Seal 6 and Seal 7, as his 144,000. We are protected through the trumpets, and then after the trumpets, probably we will die during the cups. And it can be a sad thing to think about if we're thinking in the natural. But if we think about it from the point of view of the spiritual, it's actually a very good thing, because we will rest from our labors and our works follow us, meaning the trials and tribulations and troubles of this life will be no more. And that's a wonderful blessing. That'll be a wonderful thing. So verse 14. "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another messenger came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." Now, we're talking about the grain harvest, but what we're really saying here is this whole statue that King Nebuchadnezzar dreamt of, set up on the earth in 5 parts. We've reached the end of the vision. We've come to the time of the 2 feet of iron mixed with clay. We've come to the end of the trumpets. We've come to the end of these times. And at this point, Yahweh knows who's going to be faithful to him, who's going to keep and obey the faith once delivered to the saints, and who's not. So at this point, Yahweh knows who is the grain and who is the chaff, who is the grain and who is the grain and what is the stubble that will be burned up in the end time fires. So what we need to know is we need to make sure that we are walking and obeying as grain. And then whatever happens around us in this life doesn't really matter. So we just focus on our walk and our connection with him, and everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be all right. So verse 16. So he who sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. Again, talking of the grain harvest. So again, we saw there's 2 grain harvests, so there may be more than one harvesting. We're not sure. We don't know this. So there's a barley harvest at the Passover, a wheat harvest at Pentecost. And next, what we're going to see is we're going to see the grape harvest, or the harvest of the vine. And again, these may be what is used symbolically to fill the cups of wrath, if you will. So verse 17. It says, "Then another messenger came out of the temple which is in heaven." So again, this is a vision of what's taking place in heaven. "He also having a sharp sickle. And another messenger came out from the altar, who had power over fire. And he cried with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, 'Thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe.'" So again, at this point, whoever the clusters represent, Yahweh is going to know who are the fruitful clusters and who is not making it. Verse 19 says, "So the messenger thrust his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of Elohim. And the winepress was trampled outside the city being Jerusalem. And blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs, or in the Greek it reads 1,600 stadia." So there's some discussion among scholars as to exactly how far 1,600 furlongs or 1,600 stadia is. Some groups say 183 miles, other groups say 200 miles, other groups say 190 miles. So we chose the middle figure. But if we take a map of the Middle East and we draw, starting at Jerusalem, and draw a radius of 190 miles, what we see is that it covers the entire land of Israel. It also covers all of Lebanon, part of Syria, most all of Jordan, including the alleged safe places of Basra and Petra, and most of the Sinai Peninsula. So these are places not to be during the cup judgments. So when Yeshua tells us, he says, when you see the abomination that makes desolate standing in the set-apart place, let him who reads, let him understand. Let him who is in Judea flee to the mountains. In other words, midway through the trumpets, when we see the abomination that makes desolate go up, then we need to leave the land of Israel. And in fact, we should leave the Middle East effectively. And we shouldn't come back to the Middle East until we're sure that all of the testing and trials are done. Because remember, we've got the second half of the trumpets is the most intense time. There's also the 7 thunders, which we don't even know what those are. And then there's the other events that take place. And then with the cups, whereas Seal 6 is going to look like a limited thermonuclear war, the cups, that's like the crescendo. That's going to be sort of an all-out nuclear war. Maybe not even a good time to be in the northern hemisphere, so to speak. But the main thing that we need to know, the main thing that we need to focus on and understand is, as Yeshua says in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28, where he says, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." And that's the truth, because ironically, and if we're taken out during this time of the cups, whether we're part of the 140, no matter, it doesn't really matter whether we are part of the remnant that survives the tribulation, or whether we're part of the 144,000 that's taken as first fruits, or whether we're part of the general harvest or harvests of the grain, or whether we're part of the vine harvest. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is that we need to be dwelling and abiding in him and hearing and obeying his voice, obeying his spirit. And ironically, if we will hear and obey his voice, if we will do those things that we know how to do, if we will be obedient to him, this is actual, and if we will love our neighbor truly as we love ourselves, this ironically is the best way to become part of the remnant that is protected through the times of trial. As Yeshua says in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 10, speaking of the assembly of Philadelphia or brotherly love, he says, "Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial, which shall come upon the whole world," or the whole earth, or the whole land, we're not sure, "to test those who dwell on the earth." Or it could even mean to test those who dwell in the land. We're not sure. But what we do know is that Yahweh is a loving Father. He's not punishing us just to punish us, but what he's doing is he's purifying and refining. And he's going to leave those who truly love their neighbors to repopulate the land and to live there during the millennium. So what have we seen so far? Let's take a look again at the simplified timeline. What we've seen is that the great harlot, Babylon, falls at trumpet 7, and that's when the kingdom is given to the saints. Then we saw 3 inset chapters, the Israel in the wilderness, the 2 beasts, or the 2 facets of the beast that come up from the sea and the land. And then we've spoken of the end time harvests. And because the end time harvests come in between the 7 trumpets and the 7 cups, we believe that this pertains either to the second half of the tribulation or to the cups, more likely to the cup judgments themselves. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you, and you can also see the full timeline, I encourage you to go to NazareneIsrael.org, where you can download a copy of the full study for free, or you can also donate to help partner with us and keep his work going. Shalom.